welcome everybody.
All right, thank you for this amazing panel and for having me. So when David emailed me and asked whether I could come, I was so excited because I saw your names and I wanted to hear about everything you're doing. So I hope you'll be as excited as I am to hear about them. So what's going to happen is they're going to present their work in 5 minutes each, and then we'll open up to the room. I will also have Slido here, so please post your questions on here, and then I'll moderate the question session at the end. Thank you. So who do we have first on the slides? Do you know? Do I need to do anything? So I believe it's David from Reach first. Is that right? Yes, thank you.
Is this somebody else's presentation I'm looking through here? Definitely not mine. I mean, I could talk about it. It looks great. I could talk about this. But shall I just keep clicking through till I come to me? Yeah, okay. Oh, that's me. Great. Right, I'll try and be really quick. You probably all know some of my sentences go on for 5 minutes, so just wave at me and shut me up when I get to 5 minutes. We were set up 5 years ago, initially just 2 people, remit of can you do something interesting with data for the regional press. We've since grown to a team of 12. We've got coders and graphic designers, a videographer, as well as data journalists, so hopefully we've proven the case to some extent for regional local journalism. We set up with 3 main questions. Where can we find important stories not being told by anybody else? We focus on exclusive stuff. Can we help people find and explore useful information about where they live? We do quite a lot of informational content. We think sharing that's important too. And equally importantly, can we do that without being boring or nerdy, which is an important thing for data journalists, I think. We're focused at audiences. We're not focused on pleasing other data journalists, which I think is important. Our key remit is news, and specifically local news. We analyse local data sets where there's a really interesting story for one of our titles. We'll write that story up, we'll get local context, we'll speak to experts. It's bespoke copy, it gets emailed out on an intelligent mailing list, so people only receive stories that are relevant to their area and relevant to their interests, crime, health, or whatever. We look at, on average, about 100 data sets a month. We get, in old money, old currency here, we get about 100 splashes, well, more than 100 splashes a year, so we tend to hit the right points, we think. In terms of where we get our news from, any data journalists could easily keep themselves in a job just by looking at officially published data. There's a huge amount of data published by government departments, by the ONS, by Europe, by various agencies. We keep a diary of that, and we on days where we know something interesting to our titles is going to come out, we'll look at it on that day and we'll analyse it on that day. But most of our data doesn't come from there. Most of our data is more proactive, so comes from freedom of information requests, comes from scraping websites, and just comes from old-fashioned ideas journalism. Could be combining data sets, could just be an idea to investigate something. We build a lot of interactives. We don't tend to do as many charts and maps. Maps don't work very well on mobile phones. We do a lot of postcodes. A lot of our interactives are sort of postcode search based. That seems to be something people really respond to. I've noticed the BBC is doing this a lot more now. It's a good thing and audiences really like it. Really good way of personalising the news and turning one news story into a news story for literally everybody in the country. So we do lots of those. Look at me skipping through a presentation that was probably supposed to take 20 minutes. Also, 1 day a week, all of our reporters have to work on projects and long-term investigations. So that's where, we're structured very much like a newsroom. So any journalist will be working on several things at once, but it's important to me to take them off diary and let them get their teeth into long-form investigations and projects. It was really interesting recently, one of our members was up at the Regional Press Awards for Specialist Reporter of the Year as a data journalist. That's not happened before. This was one of the things she'd worked on, which was she'd done a really great investigative job into structural racism in the UK with interactives, video interviews that she'd done, and so on and so forth. We work with partners quite a lot. They could be third sector partners, they could be commercial partners. We're not scared of doing commercial work. We did some really great work with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, where they gave us access to their million-strong database, and we managed to extract really interesting pages and stories for every town and country, every town and city in the UK. We also did a search for them, which did 3 million searches at the last count on our sites. But we also work with the NSPCC, we work with commercial partners, etc., etc. And just finally, we're constantly adding new things to what we do. We also make gadgets for and gadget generators for our titles. And our most recent innovation last year was we're now doing print pages for all of our daily titles, which look a bit like that, where they're investigating specific issues. And also we're doing an automated version of that for our weekly titles. They tell us the geography they're interested in, postcodes, councils, whatever. And we run some code on that, which extracts just data they're interested in for a variety of topics, how well hospitals are doing, house prices, different types of crime, and automatically turns that into half pages, which are ready to go and breathe. Thank you.
Wow, I'm not sure how to follow that speed, but I am I am American, so I'll try to. I've been told to slow my speed down. I'm Megan Lucero. I'm the director of the Bureau Local. Thank you for the amazing shout out, Emma, wherever you are earlier. Before I jump into that, though, I thought I'd give you a quick introduction. We only launched the Bureau Local a year ago, so you probably don't know who we are, and you probably don't know who I am and why I'm American working in local journalism in the UK. Prior to this, I was the data editor for the Times and the Sunday Times in London. I was the first data journalist set up in that unit there. As a lot of you can imagine, at that time it was, what is this data stuff? What do we do with it? The very first task, is by being one of the first data journalists there, was to fix the printer from someone, because that clearly was data journalism, was the same as IT. I mean, that's what we're talking about at a series of what is tech, what is data. But luckily we've moved quite a long way from that into what we're calling computational investigations. Now that sounds like a really wordy term, but ultimately it was just recognizing, wow, there's a lot of information out there, not just what government are publishing on their website, but every moment as we sit in this room right now, your phones are generating more data than a human could possibly even comprehend or analyze, and that's happening around the world. So how do we combat that? Humans can't combat computers. So it's about equipping journalists how to understand the kind of computational methods. How can we use computers to get stories that we couldn't get before? How do we dig deeper? How do we get there faster? So I went from fixing a printer to doing some investigations at the times like this. So this was pre-Panama Papers. This was when we were working on tax avoidance schemes, old school kind of journalism. Get this list in a brown envelope on a tax avoidance list. We scanned that, was able to put that list online, and then we ran that, writing a bit of code to say, where else do these names and these emails show up? So we ran it through things like the LinkedIn profiles. We ran them through lists of political donors. So this was kind of basic early days of what we were doing with data journalism, was just simply saying, a human could maybe sit there and look through troves and troves and troves of data, but actually you can work with programmers and journalists and technologists in a way to get there. So that's what we were doing. I also worked for the Sunday Times. Probably the biggest story I worked on was our revelation into Russian doping in the Olympics and World Championships. So we became known as having a unit that could handle a bit of data that was used to being able to work with that. So we had a whistleblower come forward with the blood databases from the Olympics and World Championships of athletes. So we were analyzing that and working with drug experts to look at what kind of anomalies were in that data. So that is what kind of led to that big series, which was incredible. So like I said, having this kind of interesting 3-year trajectory of running the data unit for this national news outlet, I was very intrigued by the idea that the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which is a small nonprofit based in London, whose aim is to do big public interest investigative journalism, they really wanted to try to help tackle the local the kind of local news industry issues that we've been talking about today, saying how can we contribute to that? If our aim is really to produce public interest journalism and to really ensure that power is held to account, we have to look in our own backyard. The Bureau, for context, had been doing a lot of issues sort of international, and had said, let's put some investment back in the UK. How can we help the rest of the news industry? So I was tasked with trying to say, how did you do what you did in the Times newsroom, and can you try to help all newsrooms in the UK to do that? Not an easy task, but we're trying our best. So we launched the Bureau Local a year ago with the aim to try to help support basically public interest journalism in the UK. The idea being that data is a really good way of doing that. Some newsrooms don't have the capacity to do data journalism. I wish every single newsroom had David Otwell's team. Not all of them do. So I think the aim is trying to say, hey, look, why don't we just try to help open up this process? How do we make getting that data a lot easier for newsrooms, but also how can we help connect people? The Bureau was really inspired by the ICIJ, which read the Panama Papers. So this is the group that built a collaboration of people around the world. They had a team, a data unit that was like doing all this heavy lifting of this offshore data. And then they shared it and they all collaborated. And obviously we've all known about it now is this great investigation that was kind of holding power to account. So the idea was, can we do that in the UK? Can we get reporters around the country to all work together and to really try to push the UK news agenda? And that our team would be trying to help doing some of the data along that. Basically about a month after we launched, Theresa May called a snap election. What are we going to do? I guess we'll try to figure out how we do these great collaborations, but we just dove straight in. We partnered with some civic tech organizations that brought helped us pull down some of the advertising that was happening on Facebook. We were serving these out to people. So basically when we launched, we just said, who wants to collaborate? Everything we're going to do is open. We're working with anybody that's from the hyperlocals to the regionals. We work with people from BBC, Trinity, Johnson, Argent, but also kind of every wide range you can imagine. And it was just really an idea. Right now, probably when we launched, we had about 150 people. When the election announced, we said we were going to do something. We had about 350 at that point. And at this stage, we said, okay, we're working with this organization. We'll be feeding all these local newsrooms the ads that our political parties are targeting in your area. And we were feeding that through some work here. We're crunching data as fast as we possibly could. A week before the election, we held these live journalism events. Sometimes they're called hack days, but essentially these live events in 5 cities around the country. This is just a screenshot from lots of excited people in these newsrooms. And these are basically loads of reporters. We were breaking down regional data just so you knew what kind of the electorate that was about to vote. Everyone was kind of crunching together, and we ran this, what was quite controversial, 2 days before the election. People thought Theresa May was going to come in with a sweeping majority. And basically, all these people who came into a room together, about 100 people, in 5 different cities, had sort of found how new voters actually could tip the scales. And we listed those, and they ran sort of in all kinds of local pages. So by the end of the general election, we had kind of taken not just these news reporters, but we had also worked with statisticians, programmers, journalists around the country, and we had sort of proven a concept that actually, by trying to kind of open up the process and collaborate, we can do some stuff. We worked on really important stories since then on domestic violence, lots of local stuff coming out of that. And since then, we've also looked at sort of council budgets. I think we've talked about it a few times today. Everyone's like, there's so much content to cover with that. So we were trying to say, how can we actually pull down that information about cuts to services that are happening and really share that? Again, we ran these events around the country. This time around, we don't just have journalists showing up. We had a local counselor show up. I didn't know it was going to be there. We have members of the public, teachers, a mom brought her kid. We have carers. We had all kinds of people showing up just saying accountability really matters. It really comes back to the kind of community journalism element of it. Really important stories came out of the back of that, this sort of national investigation into kind of what the kind of cuts to services we're doing to various communities. So now we're a year on. We have now, actually, since I've written the slide, nearly 700 members. We've worked with people from all across the political titles, but we've also partnered with loads of different organizations, universities giving us free space, to tech companies saying, how can we help you with some data? It's really been a great innovative project. We're here genuinely to just help bring people together when resources are tight. How can we help resource it? We open up all of our investigations. We write reporting recipes so that anyone can take our investigation and run with it. We open up all of our data. We're just trying to make the investigative process easier for any member of the public. The aim is that it shouldn't, my idea was that I didn't want to just be one data journalist in a London newsroom. I wanted to try to make this process available to anyone. And now that's meant not just for reporters, but people of the public. So it's been a really interesting journey. And of course, any of your reporters or anyone in your newsrooms who might want to be interested, please do get in touch. And that's the info.
Hi everybody, I'm Pete Sherlock from the BBC Shared Data Unit. Bear with me 2 secs. Oh, here we go. So I've worked in the regional media landscape all my life. I've worked for Archant, for NewsQuest, across London and the South East. I joined the BBC as a regional reporter in Kent about 8 years ago now, and since then I've worked for the website as a sub-editor, as a news editor, and now as a data journalist. So what is the BBC Shared Data Unit? Well, we launched back in September, and we came about as a key plank of the 3 initiatives that have been developed in collaboration between the BBC and the News Media Association. So you have the Local Democracy Reporting Service, which is up and running. That's the recruitment of 150 local democracy reporters to cover what's going on in town halls. You have the Video Bank, which is happening imminently, which is the opening up of the BBC audio and visual content from regional programmes to be used for regional websites. And you have the Shared Data Unit. And we have 2 key aims. We analyse public data on areas of public interest. So we've looked at crime, education, the key topics of public interest, and we make that information available to you guys. So we put together a toolkit for journalists to find the local story within the data set that we share. We share images, video, quotes, all the elements that you guys need to put together a story for your audience. But the second key aim of the unit is a training element. We run 12 secondments a year in which we invite journalists into our BBC team for 3 months at a time in order to gain the skills to be able to tell stories from data. And during their time with us, we have a complete training program which takes the journalists from the basics of analysing data sets through to data cleaning and data visualization. And then towards the end of our time, we move into more advanced subjects such as how to a little bit of coding and how to scrape data from websites. And I want to just quickly whiz through why I think that's really important. And like any good journalist, I'm going to throw out some facts. So there was a recent survey by a data science company called Count Open. They surveyed 2,000 people, and they found that 83% of people said they would not know how to interpret data when looking at a spreadsheet. They wouldn't know how to gain any insights from that data. And I personally think in a digital age, in a data-driven economy, that's a problem for society. But I also think it's a problem for journalism. So the government's actually quite good when it comes to open data. The UK government is ranked quite highly when it comes to transparency and making its information available. It's tiny, but the UK is ranked 8th on the Open Data Index, tucked under Canada and above Australia. So, and the main portal that it makes that data available is on www.gov.uk. It's the one-stop shop for journalists to go to find data. At the last count, I think there were more than 18,000 data sets on from 25 ministerial departments. The BBC data is on there, corporations, as well as 385 agencies, public bodies, quangos. All that, most of that, a load of data is going on there, and dozens are being released every day. A colleague of mine was speaking to someone from the site, and 66% of those spreadsheets, those data sets, have never been opened. And 84% have been opened only once or less. That's a kind of staggering number of potential stories for our audiences that are going unexamined and untouched, that's data which is on every aspect of people's lives, on crime, on education, on health, and it's sitting there without getting any scrutiny from us as journalists. And it kind of, in my mind, I see it as a kind of shift in our role, that back maybe 10, 20 years ago, information was scarce, and we were, I think the journalist role was more as a kind of hunter-gatherer role. You would go out to get information, you would go to this, you could deploy to a scene because no one knew what was going on. You would ask the who, what, when, why. But now that information is out there, we've got a situation where there's an asymmetry between the amount of information being made public and the number of journalists with the skills to interrogate that data. And so the Data Journalism Secondment Scheme is aimed at strengthening the number of people who can do that, the number of people in the sector who can find those stories and tell those stories to our audiences. So that's where we come in. If anyone's interested in finding out more, just find me on Twitter. It's a really interesting, it's a really fun scheme, and there's a potential to learn loads. So yeah, that's where we come in. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm the robot. Actually, I'm called Gary Rogers, and I'm the editor of Radar. Some people in the room will be familiar with Radar, others not. So let me start with what is Radar? What is Radar? What is Radar? Radar is a joint venture between the Press Association and Urbs Media, which is a data journalism startup. We're often described as an AI business. We're interested in how journalists can work with AI tools to achieve more things. We set out with a few objectives in the project. We wanted to find a way to do something which is really difficult in news. We wanted to try and bring scale to news and to the local news business. And we wanted to do so in an area of quality content. And we wanted to try to deliver a daily diet of news stories. We wanted to get a daily feed of data-driven stories out, if we could. And we wanted to try to make that relevant for every newsroom. Not just big newsrooms, but little newsrooms, little single-person newsrooms even. We want to try and make this a possibility for every newsroom. So like some of my fellow panelists here, we started this journey with open data. As Peter has just been saying, there's masses of open data there. There's more than people can look at. It's self-evident. Journalists in newsrooms don't have time to go through all the material that is available, but I think we all recognize that there's buried treasure in those data sets. There are stories in those data sets if we can get at them. Some journalists potentially are slightly worried or a little bit wary of getting involved in trying to interpret a spreadsheet and write stories from it. The BBC unit is doing something to help with that skills deficit. Now, a good amount of data in the open data world is divided geographically, typically by a local authority, but it could be data from an NHS trust, or it could be a police force. So in all these data sets, there's a big story, but there is potentially a story for every little piece of geography there. Every row of data potentially has a story. Now, it makes no sense for hundreds of journalists to all look at the same data set and all write a story about their row. To us, it made sense to try to do that in some way centrally, so that we could try to deliver a story for everyone from every row of that data. To do this is where the AI bit comes in. To do this, we turn to a technology called natural language generation. In simple terms, NLG, as it's called, is a way of turning a sheet of numbers into a page of words. Most experiments with NLG in the media area have involved journalists working with developers. We wanted to do something slightly different. What we wanted to do was to put that tool into the hands of the journalist, because we felt that was the only way we could do a genuine news service, that a journalist was in charge of that in a much quicker, slicker process. So we're building a team of reporters who see NLG software as the thing they write on. Simple as that. They just write in this tool. So what do? To write a story, they have to write a template for a story. They have to write every eventuality of the story as they can see it in the data set. Now, in simple terms, that might be writing sentences which cover off whether a number goes up, a number goes down, or a number stays the same. But as you all know in this room, there's more to telling the story than that. You have to get an angle right. So we have to write a multifaceted template which covers all the angles, so that for each row of the data, that story is the best angle we can possibly get, as well as having all the right numbers and computation in it. As you can imagine, this takes slightly longer than writing a story. It might take a day to do a template, but at the end of it, I can take the template and I can take, say, 391 rows of data from local authorities, and so I can generate 391 individual stories from a day's work. We kicked off the project last September. There were just 2 people. So our first task was to talk to all of you and to put together a pilot group from all the news groups across the UK to get a mix of the geography of the UK and also weeklies, dailies, online-only titles from all the groups, and some hyperlocals, independents as well. First thing we did was to hire some reporters and train those reporters. And while we were still building a workflow and a technology for how to do this, which is slightly uncharted territory, we thought it would be good to just start producing stories as quickly as we could. So by the end of November, we thought we were competent enough to send out some stories to the titles in the pilot group, about 40 titles. So since November, we've sent out about 90 stories. We sent out 40 versions of all those stories, 1 for each title in the pilot group. So it's thousands of pieces of copy, and tracking that can be quite difficult. So we think we've had well in excess of 1,000 stories published across all your titles, print and online. I said at the start that I wanted to try to help every newsroom, no matter the size. So what does a newsroom get from a Radar story? We're an agency service, so what you get is finished copy that's ready to publish. Many stories will be used quickly online. The stories are not just the numbers. The stories have comment and context at a national level in them to make them a rounded story that's ready and fit to publish. But many titles choose to work with them to add some local color, local context, and local comment. And in some cases, to use the stories as a source of something bigger to do a number on. And I've been pleasantly surprised by the spreads and splashes that have started to appear already, sourced from our work. We've tried in the early phase to range across topics to see what works. We've done a lot of health data, but we've also done transport and education and environment and crime and some lifestyle and demographic things. We've tried to range across the main beats of local news. So what do we do next? Distribution was always going to be a big challenge for us. So if we're producing hundreds of versions of every story, we have to get the right version, and only that version, to the right end user. So we're now building a system that maps the data so that it maps it to a single geography. So you'll get your story about your local authority or every layer of that local authority, but you also get the hospitals in that area, the police force that covers that area, the fire service, the political constituencies that align to that area. So you'll end up getting a smart feed of these stories. So far, we've relied on a representative from each of the major groups to act as a sort of gatekeeper for us. I send them physically the copy, and there are some of them in this room today, and I'm very grateful for their work, and also for their feedback in helping us to develop this as a service. I'm happy to tell them that in the next few days, we will be able to launch a web-based delivery system. So we'll be able to get people just to go to this website. This enables us to step up and go to the next stage for Radar. And the next stage for Radar is for us to not send out 40 versions of every story, but to make available hundreds of versions of every story, every row of the data that we can turn into a story. And to extend out a full, free, UK-wide trial so that any title can come to this website, put in their local authority area, and pull down all the stories we've managed to do on that. We hope that all of you will continue to use the service and will make good use of that copy, and we hope we're giving you stories that might otherwise have remained buried in data and were passed by. Thank you.
Right, so we haven't got much time, but luckily I've got some questions on Slido. And so there are two types of questions. One is about, the data journalism in the newsroom. So the first question is, should all journalists be data journalists? Or, is it going to be more of a specialist role? So I don't know, I'm opening up to all of you. What do you think?
Yes.
Of course.
To an extent, yeah. I mean, every journalist would benefit from being data literate and from having data skills. So if you're a crime journalist, you need to know your way around crime stats. You need to know where they're published. Oh, that was weird. You need to know where they're published. You need to know how to analyse them. But there should still be a role for a specialist data journalist, I think. It's just that they should be aiming to push the bar a bit higher in terms of where they're finding data from and how they're using that data. So, yeah, they should be data literate, but they shouldn't necessarily be data journalists per se, I think.
Yeah, I would just second that. What's loud? I think 90% of data journalism is done in Excel. I'm not a coder or a programmer. I come from a journalistic background, and I personally, there is a specialist teams where David has got coders and programmers making fantastic interactives, but there is a level of data which you can access on a daily basis to very quickly find and identify stories which you just need Excel or Google Sheets, and you could probably learn those skills in a couple of weeks. Would you?
Sorry, I know we need to move on. I'm just going to add to that. I think there is an element that everyone needs to be 100% aware of the future of where information is published and how you do that. But I think, agree kind of with David, that there is a specialist area that you don't need to do. And I think people get really scared, like they have to go learn programming. That is not what you need to do. But you need to know what's possible. So I think how many journalists know how a website is built, for instance. I think it's really important to know those computers you use. How does it work? How do those websites built? How's that information there? When you start to understand that, you know how a programmer could scrape that website, for instance. You might not have to be the one that scrapes it, but if you don't know how that system is created, you don't know how to sort of dismantle it. And that's kind of journalism 101, whether you're looking at systemic institutions or a data set. But I think that's an important facet of it.
Interesting. To me, there are two levels of data journalism. There is the data crunching, and then there is the visualization. So, it's also being able to connect with your audience and leveraging some of the data sets and making it in an appealing way. So, I guess all of that, but an awareness is probably the way to go. So, I have another question on collaboration. Would it be better, and so this is Nick. Nick, thank you for all your questions. Would it be better to combine all elements of your different teams to create even more impact?
I mean, I think that's the definition of collaboration. We're recognizing that we're in an industry that's just being squeezed, right? So how do we recognize where your strengths are and where others have that. So I mean, the way that we work is exactly that. You know, we work with people who are on the ground who see an issue or are affected by an issue, but we also work with, you know, coders or technologists who say, my skill set is I can pull down that website for you and look through loads of data, and then we'll have lawyers who come in and say, I can bring a legal perspective. But equally in this panel, as you sort of mentioned, yeah, you know, my team isn't doing AI work yet. I think we're all doing completely different things. Yeah, maybe we should be combining to create a superpower that can hold sort of power to account. But I think in some way we somewhat are. I think you'd be surprised. The data journalism industry is we're quite open, and we do build. No one's work is off your own back. You're built off someone else's. I think that's actually how computers are built themselves, open software and things like that.
It's kind of a bit like saying, you know, if we're not careful, we're going down this, well, you're all data journalists, so you should all work together. And would you say that about newspapers? It's the same question, isn't it? Like, there's loads of data. It's not competitive in the same way as newspapers aren't necessarily directly competing with each other. So to me, we're all aiming to do the same thing, which is create amazing content, basically, tell amazing stories. And yeah, obviously there are opportunities for collaboration in data which may not exist, but in a sense it's the same question, why don't all newspapers collaborate with each other all the time? And there are some good reasons for that, and there are some less good reasons for that.
I think the one other thing to add is that for Peter and myself started work on our things last September, Megan just a little bit before. We're all quite early in the area at the moment, and I think as this sort of spills through, we might find that we collaborate on some things, but also we work out areas so that we can be complementary to each other, not competitive with each other.
Just going back to the first question we had, what would you say, so if you're saying everybody should have an awareness, what are the 3 things someone with no data journalism should learn first?
Excel, and then Google Sheets as well.
Yeah, I'd agree spreadsheets are obviously really important, but to me, knowing where data is, knowing what data is available is hugely important. The number of times you'll be asked by somebody, is there any data available on this? Or we've got hold of these figures on such and such, and you'll say, well, they are published every month. There are more recent figures. And, you know, having that degree of literacy about what's out there, I think, is really important. And 3, storytelling skill, I think, is more important actually with data journalism. It's, you know, anybody's going to be interested in a story about, you know, somebody who's just died in a car crash. That's not a hard story to tell in a sense, but getting people really interested in a data story, that's much more difficult. And that's the thing, that the bit of data that data journalists don't always like to talk about is how many people are actually reading this, you know, and it's the most important one, I imagine, to all of you and to us as well. And that's largely dependent on storytelling skills, I think.
Before we go to Pete, so you mentioned Gov, Gov UK as a database. Is there such a thing as a directory then of all the data sets you can find? Or should, one of you produce that directory?
It's completely searchable. I mean, with Gov or statistics.gov, you can search by keywords. It's a really, really good search system. You type in.
So that's the one place.
Absolutely, completely agree with you.
In terms of the skills, I would say, definitely Excel, Google Sheets, learn about, what a spreadsheet actually is and what a relational database is. There's loads of online resources, free. School of Data is a perfect place to pick up those initial skills. Ask your company if they'll fund a license for some of the paid fors, like lynda.com or Pluralsight. They're the kind of key places that I would venture into first to get a kind of a grip with it, with what a spreadsheet is and what you can do with it.
I agree with everything before. The things I would add are really, like I said, you need to have a critical understanding of information as well. So like a stats 101, like go online, find a tutorial. You'd be surprised at how many journalists don't know sort of basic statistics. Like how did relatively simple drops in figures or increases in figures, how do you represent that? And I think I think actually a lot of journalists I've worked with are trained have sort of said, I'm afraid of looking, maybe I finally understand an Excel spreadsheet, but then what if I report it incorrectly? So I think having a basic statistics is really crucial. Understanding how technology works and is evolving, be abreast of what's happening, like how information is changing, how all that is there, because that's part of the process. And then having a really critical eye on how that's there, because all these data sets, most of them are still curated by humans. There is human error sitting in all of them. Just because there are more rape cases in the data set doesn't necessarily mean there are more rapes, but there are more reported rapes, for instance. So the thing you have to think about is how that data is collected, and really what are the human levels behind that. So I think it's basic journalism. The truth is, like, data journalism is just taking the gut instinct of being a journalist, like really asking those questions and like really challenging every element of it, and just apply that to kind of new technology.
Thank you. How are we doing on time? Because I'm not sure whether there is a break before the next session. Or, no? Okay, so I have 4 minutes, right? Yes, good. So I don't know whether there are any questions in the audience. I have one last one here, which is, oh no, two. Is there a local counterpart of the Panama Papers waiting to be uncovered through data journalism?
I mean, I think my argument is that there is, like, that's what my project was founded on, is the idea of that, or at least the idea of that, like, that collaborative power could happen. But yeah, of course, like, most of that, loads of that offshore data had UK holdings there. There's a lot of data, yes, that is published, but there's a lot that's not. A lot of private company data, a lot of private entities are just completely hidden. You sort of have you have a whole element of society that's not published on there, and I think that's where loads of whistleblowers have been coming forward lately, whether that's in the US, but recently here in the UK as well. Sometimes that is a really good inroad into that, and Panama Papers was that as well. So you have to think about the whistleblowing side of it, of things that are private, but then I think there probably are, as we just outlined today, there are loads of data sets that are still untouched, still unseen. How can we harness that?
Yeah, I think I'd just add that the fact that I think a data investigation can be time consuming, and if you're putting together your own data set and you're not using a public data set, you're gathering sources from different areas, perhaps multiple data sets, or building it from scratch, and that takes a long time. And I think the fact that in various ways we're all investing, giving journalists the time and the space away from the daily news grind to actually do those kind of things, and I think it makes the publication of something big like the Panama Papers more possible.
Okay. Did you want to comment? No. So last question, and then we're done. Is so going back to some data sets are not open at all. Which authorities or bodies are the worst when it comes to being open with data?
I tell you, Scotland's not very good. Scotland's not very good. Scotland's awful for data. Well, it's getting better, actually. It's putting its data online in feeds now. I don't know. Has anybody got a strong feeling?
Pete? Yes,
I think David's right that I think devolution and taking Scotland and Northern Ireland out of the centralised statistical mechanisms has made it more challenging. Sometimes different release calendars scheduled very differently, so getting a UK-wide picture of things sometimes can be rather difficult. So we're looking at how we do those independently and separately. NHS data can sometimes seem impenetrable, but sometimes to do with the data supplies, and as Megan has alluded to, most of the data is gathered by a human at some point, and so it's not infallible.
I'm afraid we're running out of time, so could you please thank our panelists? And I forgot to mention, David, you picked up an award on Friday for the data unit. Yes, so congratulations.